The morning sun poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, lighting up Elijah Montgomery's corner office on the 87th floor. Outside, New York City buzzed with life. Inside, Elijah stared at spreadsheets on his computer screen, feeling nothing. At 38, he had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. His tech company, Montgomery Innovations, had changed how the world used smartphones. His face had been on the cover of business magazines. People called him a genius. Yet as he sipped his perfectly made coffee, he wondered why success felt so empty. "Mr. Montgomery, your board meeting starts in 5 minutes," his assistant said from the doorway. Elijah nodded without looking up. Another day, another meeting where people would tell him how brilliant he was while secretly fearing his cold judgment. In the meeting room, 12 executives sat straight-backed in leather chairs. They fell silent when Elijah walked in. He didn't smile as he took his seat at the head of the table. "Let's make this quick," he said, loosening his tie slightly. "I have a flight to catch." He didn't actually. He had nowhere special to be. It was just something he said to keep meetings short. "Our quarterly numbers look excellent," began the finance director, clicking through slides of charts pointing upward. "Profits are up 22% from last year." Elijah barely listened. He'd read the reports already. More money, more growth, more of the same. He felt a strange itch inside him, a restlessness that had been growing for months. As the presentation droned on, his mind wandered to the empty penthouse waiting for him, to the weekend with nothing planned except a workout with his trainer. He had achieved everything he'd set out to do since he was a hungry, ambitious 20-year-old coding in his college dorm room. Now what? And finally, said his chief of acquisitions, about that small tech startup in Seattle. "Buy it," Elijah interrupted. The room fell silent. "Sir?" the man asked, clearly confused. "We haven't finished the evaluation. It could cost upwards of $1 billion. I said buy it." Elijah's tone left no room for discussion. "Their work on artificial intelligence has potential. Make it happen by Monday." His executives exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't how business decisions were usually made, especially not billion-dollar ones. "Will there be anything else?" Elijah asked, already standing. No one spoke. He left the room without another word, leaving whispers in his wake. Back in his office, Elijah stared out at the city. The decision he'd just made should have excited him. Instead, he felt nothing. He checked his watch, 7 hours until the charity gala he was expected to attend. Another evening of fake smiles and small talk with people who either wanted his money or his connections. Later that evening, Elijah's driver dropped him off at the Grand Plaza Hotel. Camera flashes greeted him as he walked the red carpet into the ballroom. His black tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his smile practiced and empty. "Mr. Montgomery, over here," called journalists. He waved briefly, then escaped inside. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and wealth. Women in designer dresses and men in expensive suits mingled, champagne glasses in hand. Elijah grabbed a drink from a passing waiter and found a quiet corner, scanning the room with disinterest. "They're saying your company might hit $1 trillion valuation next year," said an older businessman who approached him. "That'll make you the richest man in America." Elijah gave a tight smile. "Numbers on a screen," he said, though 5 years ago, reaching that milestone would have meant everything to him. As the businessman launched into a story about his own investments, Elijah's attention drifted across the room. That's when he saw her. She stood near the stage, deep in conversation with the event organizer. Unlike the other women in glittering gowns, she wore a simple dark green dress. Her brown hair fell in natural waves past her shoulders, but what caught his attention was the intensity in her eyes as she spoke, hands moving with passion about whatever she was discussing. "Excuse me," Elijah said, not caring if he was being rude to the businessman. "Who is that woman by the stage?" A server passing by followed his gaze. "That's Lena Carter. She runs Earth Revival, a non-profit that fights against corporate pollution. Surprised to see her here, honestly. She usually avoids these fancy events." Elijah found himself moving across the room without consciously deciding to do so. As he got closer, he caught snippets of her conversation. "The damage is already severe, but not irreversible if we act now." She stopped mid-sentence when she noticed him. Their eyes met, and for the first time in years, Elijah felt something stir within him, Curiosity, interest, maybe even a touch of nervousness. How strange. Mr. Montgomery, the event organizer said, clearly surprised by his approach. Have you met Ms. Carter? Her organization is one of our smaller grant recipients this year. We haven't met, Elijah said, extending his hand. Elijah Montgomery. I know who you are, Lena replied, shaking his hand firmly. Her eyes held no admiration, no awe at his wealth or status, only a cool assessment. Your factories in Malaysia are among the worst environmental offenders we've documented this year. The event organizer's face fell in horror at her directness, but Elijah felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward in what might have been the beginning of a genuine smile. Is that so? He asked, genuinely interested for the first time that evening. Perhaps you should tell me more about that. As Lena began to speak, her words clear and unflinching, Elijah realized he was actually listening, really listening, to another person for the first time in longer than he could remember. The restlessness inside him quieted, replaced by something he couldn't yet name. But whatever it was, it felt like waking up. Lena didn't mince words. Right there, in the middle of the glittering charity gala, she told Elijah exactly what his company was doing to the environment. Her voice grew more passionate with each sentence, and people nearby began to take notice of the unlikely pair, the cold billionaire and the fiery environmentalist. Your factories dump chemical waste into rivers that local communities depend on for fishing and drinking water, she said, her green eyes locked on his. The air pollution from your manufacturing plants has caused respiratory problems in children living nearby. Elijah watched her lips move, noting how she didn't seem intimidated by him at all. Most people treated him like he might explode if they said the wrong thing. Her fearlessness was refreshing. And you have proof of these allegations? He asked, keeping his voice calm. Lena reached into her small purse and pulled out a thumb drive. Everything's here. Water and soil samples, medical reports from local clinics, satellite imagery showing forest degradation around your facilities. She held it out. I've been trying to get a meeting with someone from your company for months, but your people keep blocking me. A small crowd had gathered around them now, watching the exchange with unconcealed interest. The charity event organizer looked like he might faint. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private, Elijah suggested, suddenly aware of the attention they were attracting. Lena glanced around and nodded. Fine. He led her to a small meeting room off the main ballroom. As soon as the door closed behind them, she continued as if there had been no interruption. Your company makes fancy speeches about corporate responsibility while poisoning the planet. It's not just wrong, it's hypocritical. Elijah leaned against a table, studying her. You're very direct, Miss Carter. Lena, she corrected. And yes, I am. The planet doesn't have time for politeness. He found himself smiling slightly. Most people wouldn't dare speak to me this way. I'm not most people, she replied. And you're just a man, Mr. Montgomery. A powerful one, yes, but still just a man. Elijah, he countered. For the first time, she seemed thrown off balance. What? If I'm calling you Lena, you should call me Elijah. She shrugged. Fine. Elijah. He liked how his name sounded in her voice. It was strange. He couldn't remember the last time he'd noticed something so small about another person. So Lena, he said, crossing his arms. You've clearly done your research. What exactly do you want from me? Money for your organization. Her eyes flashed with anger. I don't want your charity. I want you to stop destroying the environment. Change your manufacturing processes. Clean up the messes you've already made. That would cost billions. You have billions, she shot back. Besides, since when did doing the right thing need to be profitable? Someone knocked on the door, and the event organizer peeked in nervously. Mr. Montgomery, they're about to announce the major donors. They need you on stage. Elijah waved him away. Tell them I'll be there shortly. When they were alone again, he found himself saying something unexpected. You know, my company employs over 50,000 people worldwide. If I shut down those factories you're concerned about, what happens to those workers? Lena didn't hesitate. There are cleaner ways to manufacture your products. Companies like yours choose the cheaper, dirtier options to maximize profits. You could keep those jobs and make changes. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, she admitted, but it is necessary. Elijah looked at her for a long moment. Something about her certainty, her unwavering belief in what she was fighting for, stirred something in him. When was the last time he'd felt so strongly about anything? "I have a proposition for you," he said suddenly. Lena raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "A bet of sorts." He straightened up, feeling more energized than he had in months. "You think my factories are as harmful as you claim? I think you may be exaggerating." "I'm not," she began. He held up a hand. "Let me finish. I'll give you full access to any of my facilities worldwide. Bring your scientists, your equipment, whatever you need. If you can prove that my operations are causing the damage you claim, I'll invest $5 billion in completely overhauling our manufacturing processes and cleaning up any environmental damage." Her eyes widened slightly. "And if I can't prove it? Then you come work for Montgomery Innovations as our new Environmental Impact Director for 3 years. Help us find better solutions from the inside." Lena stared at him, clearly caught off guard. "You want to hire me? Either way, changes get made," Elijah explained. "The question is whether they're driven by your proof or by your direct involvement in my company." She narrowed her eyes. "This is just a game to you, isn't it? Some amusing distraction from your boring billionaire life." Her words hit closer to home than she could know. But instead of anger, he felt a spark of something like excitement. "Maybe," he admitted, "but it's a game with real stakes. $5 billion worth of environmental change. Isn't that worth playing for?" Lena bit her lip, considering. "I'd need complete access, no restrictions." "Done. And a team of my choosing." "Absolutely. And all expenses covered." "Naturally." She studied his face, looking for the catch. "Why are you doing this?" It was a good question, one he wasn't entirely sure how to answer. "Let's just say you've made me curious." After a moment of silence, she extended her hand. "You have a deal." As they shook hands, Elijah felt a jolt of something. Energy. Connection? He couldn't name it, but it was the most alive he'd felt in years. "You're making a mistake, Elijah," she said, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. "I'm going to win this bet." "We'll see," he replied, surprised to find himself hoping she might be right. From across the room, a photographer captured the moment, the billionaire and the environmentalist shaking hands, neither aware that their impulsive bet was about to change both their lives forever. Outside the door, the event organizer wrung his hands anxiously. "Mr. Montgomery, please, they're waiting." "I'm coming," Elijah called back. He turned to Lena. "My assistant will contact you tomorrow to work out the details." As they walked back into the ballroom together, whispers followed them. Elijah could feel Lena's determination radiating from her. For the first time in a very long time, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow. 3 days after the charity gala, Lena stood in the lobby of Montgomery Innovations headquarters, her worn leather messenger bag slung over her shoulder. The sleek glass and steel building seemed to touch the clouds, and everything inside screamed money, from the marble floors to the giant living wall of plants that ironically displayed the company's supposed commitment to sustainability. Miss Carter. A woman with a perfect suit and an even more perfect smile approached. "I'm Claire, Mr. Montgomery's executive assistant. We've prepared a workspace for you and your team." Lena nodded, glancing at the 3 people who accompanied her: Dr. Patel, a renowned environmental scientist; Thomas, her organization's data analyst; and Riley, their legal expert who specialized in environmental law. They stood out among the corporate types hustling through the lobby, looking slightly uncomfortable in their business casual attire. "Is Mr. Montgomery available?" Lena asked. Claire's smile didn't waver. "He's in meetings all morning, but has requested to join you for lunch." As they followed Claire to the elevators, Lena caught whispers from employees watching them pass. Word had clearly spread about the unusual bet between their boss and the environmentalist. The elevator whisked them to the 55th floor, where Claire led them to a large corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows and several workstations equipped with the latest technology. "This will be your base of operations," Claire explained. "You have full access to our databases, records, and communication systems. Your security clearances have been processed for all our facilities worldwide." Lena looked around, surprised by the openness. She'd expected resistance, not the red carpet treatment. "This seems generous, Dr. Patel remarked after Claire left. Don't be fooled, Lena replied, setting down her bag. This is just part of the game to him. Let's get to work. They spent the morning sifting through manufacturing reports, environmental compliance documents, and internal memos. By noon, they had identified 3 main facilities with the most troubling environmental records, one in Malaysia, one in Mexico, and one in Eastern Europe. A knock at the door interrupted their work. Elijah stood there, his imposing figure filling the doorway, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Lena's annual salary. How's the investigation going? He asked, his expression unreadable. Lena straightened her shoulders. We've only just begun. Good. I thought you might be hungry. He gestured to someone in the hallway, and 2 staff members wheeled in carts of food, not the standard corporate lunchboxes, but a spread that looked like it came from a high-end restaurant. You didn't need to do this, Lena said, uncomfortable with the display. Elijah shrugged. I eat, you eat. Seemed simple enough. He turned to Patim. Dr. Patel, I've read some of your research on industrial impact on water systems. Impressive work. Dr. Patel looked surprised to be recognized. Thank you. And you must be Thomas and Riley, Elijah continued, nodding to the others. Lena chose her team well. As they ate, the conversation remained surprisingly civil. Elijah asked thoughtful questions about their initial findings, never becoming defensive when they pointed out concerning patterns in his company's practices. Your Malaysia plant shows emissions far exceeding local regulations, Thomas noted, pushing his tablet across the table to show Elijah the data. Those regulators can be persuaded to look the other way, Elijah admitted. It's common practice. Common doesn't make it right, Lena countered. Elijah's eyes met hers. I never said it did. Something in his tone made Lena pause. Was the ruthless businessman actually acknowledging wrongdoing? After lunch, Elijah surprised them again. I've arranged for the company jet to take you to Malaysia tomorrow. You should see the operations firsthand. You're coming with us? Lena asked, startled. A small smile played at his lips. Would you prefer I didn't? The truth was, she wasn't sure. His presence was distracting. It's your plane, she said finally. So it is. He stood to leave. Pack for humid weather. And Lena? Don't wear those nice leather shoes. The factory floors can be messy. After he left, Riley let out a low whistle. He's not what I expected. Don't be charmed, Lena warned. He's built an empire by being clever and calculating. But she couldn't deny a growing curiosity about the man behind the billionaire mask. The next morning found them on Elijah's private jet, a luxury experience none of Lena's team had ever encountered. While her colleagues marveled at the amenities, Lena tried to stay focused on reviewing documents. Elijah sat across from her, his jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, reading something on his tablet. Occasionally, she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You should try to sleep, he suggested after several hours. It's a long flight. I've got work to do, she replied without looking up. The documents will still be there when you wake up. Lena finally glanced up at him. Why are you really doing this, Elijah? This bet, flying us around the world on your private jet. What's your angle? He set down his tablet and considered her question. Would you believe me if I said I'm not entirely sure myself? No. He laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his usually serious face. Fair enough, he paused. Let's just say your passion for something meaningful made me realize how little that exists in my world. Before she could respond, he stood and moved to another section of the plane, leaving Lena to wonder about the glimpse of vulnerability she'd just witnessed. In Malaysia, the reality of Montgomery Innovations' impact became impossible to ignore. The massive factory sat near a once beautiful river that now ran with unnatural colors. Local villages showed signs of poverty despite the promise of economic opportunity the factory had brought. Elijah remained quiet as they toured the facility, watching Lena and her team collect samples and interview workers. His face betrayed nothing, but she noticed how he listened intently to everything, occasionally making notes on his phone. On the third day, Lena insisted on visiting a nearby village. The company driver seemed reluctant until Elijah firmly instructed him to take them. The village elder welcomed them into his modest home, speaking through a translator about how the water had changed, how the children developed rushes and breathing problems, how the fish had disappeared. Lena watched Elijah as he crouched down to speak with a small boy who was clearly suffering from respiratory issues. Something shifted in his expression, the cool businessman facade cracking to reveal something that looked remarkably like guilt. That evening, as they prepared to leave for their next destination, Lena found Elijah alone on the hotel balcony, staring out at the lights of the factory visible in the distance. "You knew," she said, joining him at the railing. "You knew how bad it was." He didn't look at her. "I knew the reports. I never saw it with my own eyes." "Does seeing it make a difference?" Elijah turned to her then, his eyes reflecting something she hadn't seen before. "Shouldn't it?" The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, they stood in silence, the warm night air filled with unspoken questions. "People aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, Elijah," she said softly. "Their lives matter." "I know that," he replied, his voice unusually quiet. "Do you? When was the last time you thought about the real-world consequences of your business decisions?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his honesty surprised her. Too long, probably. Lena hadn't expected this, the possibility that Elijah Montgomery might actually be changing his perspective. It complicated things in ways she hadn't anticipated. As they stood side by side, looking out at the damage his company had caused, Lena realized something was shifting between them. This wasn't just about winning a bet anymore. It was about whether a man who had spent his life pursuing profit could truly change his heart. And despite her best efforts to remain detached, she found herself hoping he could. After 2 weeks of visiting factories, collecting samples, and interviewing workers, Lena's team had gathered enough evidence to show the environmental damage Elijah's company was causing. But something unexpected was happening. Elijah was changing before their eyes. In Mexico, he'd spent hours talking with the local mayor about building a water treatment facility. In Eastern Europe, he'd fired a plant manager on the spot after discovering safety violations being hidden from corporate oversight. With each stop, the cold businessman was becoming more engaged, more concerned with the human cost of his empire. And Lena was noticing other things too. How his eyes crinkled slightly when he genuinely smiled, how he remembered everyone's coffee preferences, how he listened to her with complete attention when she spoke. "The evidence is overwhelming," Dr. Patel announced one evening as they reviewed their findings in the hotel conference room they'd set up as a temporary office. The soil samples show toxic levels of heavy metals, the water contamination extends kilometers beyond the factory grounds, and the air quality readings are frankly alarming. Lena nodded, feeling strangely conflicted about their success. "We've got everything we need to prove our case." "So you win the bet," Elijah said quietly from the doorway. No one had heard him arrive. The room fell silent as he walked in, loosening his tie. He looked tired, the weight of what he'd seen over the past weeks visible in the shadows under his eyes. "It seems so," Lena agreed, studying his reaction. Elijah nodded slowly. "I'll have the lawyers draw up the paperwork for the $5 billion environmental remediation fund tomorrow." Thomas and Riley exchanged surprised glances. They hadn't expected him to concede so easily. "You don't seem upset about losing," Lena observed. Something like a smile flickered across Elijah's face. "Maybe I didn't lose. Maybe I just learned something worth more than money." He glanced at his watch. "Get some rest, everyone. We fly back to New York tomorrow." After the others left, Lena stayed behind, organizing the piles of reports and data they'd collected. She sensed rather than heard Elijah return to the room. "Can't we talk?" he asked. "Not about factories or pollution or business. Just talk." She looked up, surprised by the request. "Okay." "Not here," he said. "There's a small island about 20 minutes from here. My family has owned it for years. I'd like to show it to you." Lena hesitated. Being alone with Elijah felt increasingly complicated. The lines between professional adversaries and whatever they were becoming had blurred with each passing day. "Just for dinner," he added. "The boat will bring you back whenever you want to leave." Something in his eyes, a vulnerability she'd never expected to see in Elijah Montgomery, made her nod. "All right." The island was small but beautiful, with a modest beach house that looked nothing like what she'd expect from a billionaire. The wooden structure blended with the natural surroundings, its wide porch facing the ocean. This was my grandfather's fishing retreat, Elijah explained as they walked along the shoreline. The only property I own that I didn't buy myself. It's beautiful, Lena said, surprised by its simplicity. As the sun began to set, they sat on the porch with a simple dinner prepared by the caretaker who had discreetly disappeared afterward. The sound of waves and night birds created a peaceful backdrop to their conversation. I never bring anyone here, Elijah said suddenly. This place is separate from who I became. And who did you become? Lena asked. He looked out at the darkening horizon. Someone who measured success by the size of bank accounts and buildings. Someone who forgot to ask if any of it mattered. What changed? His eyes found hers in the fading light. You happened. The simple honesty of his words caught her off guard. She looked away, uncertain how to respond. I grew up poor, Elijah continued, filling the silence. My mother worked 3 jobs. When I was 11, she got sick, cancer, but couldn't afford proper treatment with our insurance. I promised myself I'd never be helpless like that again. Money became safety. I'm sorry about your mother, Lena said softly. She died when I was 14. I went into the foster system, bounced around until college. Got a scholarship, started coding, built my first app. He shrugged. The rest is in business magazines. Lena realized he was sharing parts of himself few people ever saw. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand why I became the person you met at that gala. The one who didn't care about villages or rivers or children getting sick. I locked that part of myself away a long time ago, the part that could be hurt by caring too much. Back in New York, the news of Elijah Montgomery's unprecedented environmental commitment spread like wildfire. Business networks featured his face constantly, with headlines questioning his sanity. $5 billion for environmental cleanup was no small gesture, especially with the additional promise to completely overhaul his manufacturing processes worldwide. He's lost his mind, one financial analyst declared on morning television as Lena watched from her small apartment. Montgomery Innovations stock dropped 12% yesterday alone. She turned off the TV, feeling strangely protective of Elijah even after she'd pulled away from him that night on the island. They'd barely spoken during the flight back, the awkwardness between them palpable. Now, back in her own world, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Patel. Have you seen the statement Montgomery released this morning? She hadn't. She quickly found it online, her eyes widening as she read. Elijah wasn't just honoring their bet, he was going far beyond it. He announced a complete sustainability overhaul of every Montgomery facility worldwide, effective immediately. The estimated cost, close to $15 billion. This isn't just about compliance, his statement read. It's about responsibility. For too long, companies like mine have prioritized profit over people. That ends today. Lena's phone rang. It was Riley, her legal expert. Have you read the fine print of his announcement? He's selling off the most polluting divisions entirely. The board is in open revolt. There are rumors of a forced removal vote. They can't remove him, Lena protested. He's the majority shareholder. Not anymore, Riley replied. He's been selling shares to fund these initiatives personally. His control is slipping. Lena felt her heart sink. Was Elijah sacrificing everything he built? And was it partly because of her? Her doorbell rang. When she opened it, Claire, Elijah's executive assistant, stood there looking uncharacteristically frazzled. He wants to see you, Claire said without preamble. He's called an emergency press conference for noon. The ride to Montgomery Innovations headquarters was tense. Lena tried asking Claire what was happening, but the assistant merely shook her head. He's changed since meeting you, was all she would say. When they arrived, the building was swarming with reporters. Claire led Lena through a service entrance and up to Elijah's office. Inside, she found him standing at the window, looking out at the city. He'd lost weight in the week since they'd returned, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. You're throwing away everything you've built? Lena said softly. He turned, a faint smile touching his lips when he saw her. Not throwing away, transforming. Your board wants you out. So I've heard. He didn't seem particularly concerned. Why did you ask me here, Elijah? He walked to his desk and picked up a document. I wanted you to be the first to know. I'm establishing the Montgomery Environmental Trust, $10 billion separate from company assets, legally protected from any board action. Lena stared at him in disbelief. 10 billion? It's just money, he said simply. What good is it sitting in accounts while people suffer? She studied his face, looking for signs of the calculating businessman she first met. Is this because of what happened between us? Because if you're doing this to impress me? This isn't about you, Lena. Not anymore. His voice was gentle but firm. You woke me up, yes, but this is about who I want to be. About the legacy I want to leave. Before she could respond, the door burst open. 3 men in expensive suits stormed in, led by a silver-haired man with a red face. This ends now, Montgomery, the older man snapped. The board has called an emergency session. Your little environmental crusade is over. Elijah remained calm. Hello, Victor. I believe you know Ms. Carter. The man barely glanced at Lena. You've lost your mind. 15 billion in company resources for some tree-hugging fantasy? We have shareholders to answer to. And communities we've poisoned, Elijah replied evenly. Children whose futures we've stolen. Those matter more than quarterly profits. Victor jabbed a finger at Lena. She did this to you. This woman comes along, and suddenly 20 years of business sense goes out the window. Elijah's expression hardened. Be careful, Victor. Or what? You'll fire me? Good luck with that after the board meeting today. Victor's face twisted into something ugly. Your father built this company into something great. He'd be ashamed to see you destroying it over some bleeding heart. That's enough. Elijah's voice cut like steel. My father built this company by exploiting workers and ignoring environmental regulations. If he were alive, I'd be holding him accountable too. The room fell silent at his words. Ms. Carter showed me the truth, Elijah continued, his voice level. But the choice to act on it is mine. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a press conference to attend. He walked out, leaving Victor sputtering in rage. Lena hurried after him, catching up at the elevator. Your father, she began, was a ruthless businessman who taught me that nothing matters except the bottom line, Elijah finished for her. I followed his example for too long. In the elevator, he finally looked truly vulnerable. The board will probably succeed, you know. I've lost enough control in shares. They'll reverse as many of my decisions as they legally can. Then why do this? Why not work within the system? The elevator doors opened to the lobby level, where dozens of reporters waited. Because some systems need to be broken, he said quietly just for her ears. Then he stepped forward to face the cameras. Lena watched from the side as Elijah announced the Montgomery Environmental Trust, explaining how it would fund cleanup efforts, sustainable technology research, and community development in areas damaged by industrial pollution. His voice never wavered, even as reporters shouted questions about falling stock prices and board opposition. My final announcement, Elijah said toward the end, is my resignation as CEO of Montgomery Innovations, effective immediately. A shockwave rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed frantically. My priorities have changed, he continued. I can do more good directing my personal resources toward environmental restoration than fighting internal battles. After the press conference, security whisked Elijah away before Lena could speak with him. She tried calling him later that day, but his number had already been disconnected. For the next several months, Lena watched from a distance as Elijah's story played out in the media. He sold his Manhattan penthouse and most of his luxury possessions. The new management at Montgomery Innovations immediately scaled back many of his initiatives, though they couldn't touch the independent trust he'd established. And then he seemed to vanish. Rumors placed him everywhere from a monastery in Tibet to a private island in the Caribbean. Lena tried to focus on her work, using a significant grant from the Montgomery Trust to expand her organization's reach. But thoughts of Elijah, his smile, his vulnerability on the island, his courage in the face of opposition, lingered. 6 months after the press conference, Lena received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a hand-drawn map of a location in Costa Rica and a simple note. If you still believe people can change, I'd like to show you what I've been building. E. Lena stared at the note for a long time, her heart racing. After everything that had happened, after the way they'd left things, was she ready to see him again? to find out if his transformation was real and lasting. The truth was, she'd never stopped thinking about him, about the man who'd been willing to dismantle his empire for something he believed in. Taking a deep breath, she picked up her phone and began looking for flights to Costa Rica. The small plane dipped low over the Costa Rican rainforest, revealing patches of green interrupted by brown scars where logging had taken its toll. Lena pressed her face to the window, watching for the coordinates on the map Elijah had sent. After nearly 16 hours of travel, a mix of anxiety and excitement flooded in her stomach. "We're approaching the landing strip now," the pilot called back to her in accented English. "Mr. Montgomery built it himself, can you believe it?" Lena couldn't quite believe any of this, that she'd dropped everything to fly to Costa Rica on nothing more than a hand-drawn map, that Elijah had apparently been hiding out in the rainforest for months, that she still cared enough to find out why. The plane touched down on a surprisingly well-maintained dirt runway. As Lena stepped out into the humid air, she saw a familiar figure waiting in the shade of a small wooden structure. Elijah looked nothing like the billionaire she'd known. His designer suits were replaced by worn khaki pants and a simple linen shirt. His previously clean-shaven face now sported a short beard, and his skin had bronzed under the tropical sun. But his eyes, those were exactly the same, lighting up when they landed on her. "You came," he said simply, as if he'd been uncertain. "I came," she replied, adjusting the strap of her backpack. They stood awkwardly for a moment before he gestured to an open-air jeep. "It's about 20 minutes to the site. I'll drive." As they bumped along narrow dirt roads, the rainforest crowding in on both sides, Elijah pointed out wildlife. A family of monkeys swinging through the trees, colorful birds taking flight at their approach. Lena noticed how easily he identified each species, how his voice softened when he spoke of the forest. "You've changed," she observed. He smiled slightly. "Not changed. Just remembered who I was before money became everything." They rounded a bend, and Lena gasped. Before them stretched a once barren hillside, now covered in thousands of young trees. Workers in bright t-shirts moved between the saplings, carefully tending to each one. "What is this place?" she asked. "Redemption," Elijah answered. "This was a logging site that stripped away old-growth forest. We're bringing it back, using only native species, creating wildlife corridors, working with local communities to develop sustainable forestry practices." He parked the jeep, and they walked along paths between the young trees. Lena noticed how the workers greeted Elijah, not with the fearful deference his employees had once shown, but with the warm respect of equals. "The Montgomery Trust funds this?" she asked. "Among other projects. We've got 16 sites across 8 countries now. Places where my old companies did the most damage." They climbed to the top of a small rise where a simple platform overlooked the entire operation. In the distance, Lena could make out a cluster of buildings. "That's the research center," Elijah explained, following her gaze. "Scientists studying reforestation techniques, endangered species preservation, sustainable agriculture. We're trying to build solutions that local communities can replicate without needing billionaire funding." Lena studied his face. The hardness she'd first seen in New York was gone, replaced by something she hadn't expected: peace. "Why did you invite me here, Elijah?" she asked quietly. He turned to face her fully. "Because every time we plant a tree, every time we clean up a river, every time we help a community become self-sufficient, I think of you. Of how you made me see what really matters." His honesty took her breath away. "I'm not asking for anything," he continued. "I just wanted you to see that it wasn't a phase or a game. That the man you believed I could be, I'm trying to become him every day." A worker called out to Elijah from below, needing his help with something. He glanced back apologetically. "Stay," he said. "A day, a week, whatever you can. See what we're building here. Then decide if it's something you could be part of." As he headed down the hill, Lena watched him stop to help a young woman who was struggling with a particularly stubborn sapling. Together, they worked the small tree into the ground, Elijah's hands, once used only for signing documents and making deals, now stained with rich earth. And in that moment, watching him work alongside people restoring what had been destroyed, Lena felt something shift inside her. The wall she'd built against him began to crumble, brick by brick. 3 years had passed since Lena first stepped off that small plane in Costa Rica. What had begun as a one-week visit had turned into a shared mission and eventually a shared life. The morning sun filtered through the windows of their modest home on the edge of the research center. Lena stood at the kitchen counter, drinking coffee and reviewing plans for the day. Outside, workers and scientists were already bustling about, preparing for the big event. "Have you seen my notes for the speech?" Elijah called from the other room. "I can't find them anywhere." Lena smiled, picking up the folder sitting right in front of her. "Right here. You left them on the counter last night." Elijah appeared in the doorway, hair slightly damp from his shower. At 41, he looked younger than when she'd first met him in New York. Gone was the constant tension in his shoulders, the hardness around his eyes. Working with his hands, living close to nature, and finding purpose beyond profit had transformed him. "What would I do without you?" he asked, taking the folder and kissing her cheek. "Probably misplace a lot more speeches," she teased. They walked hand in hand along the path leading to what had once been just a barren hillside. Now thousands of trees, many reaching impressive heights, created a thriving young forest. Birds called overhead, insects buzzed, and occasionally they spotted monkeys watching them from the branches. "Nervous?" Lena asked. Elijah squeezed her hand. "A little. It's been a long time since I've faced the press." Today marked the grand opening of the Montgomery Carter Institute for Sustainable Innovation, built on what had once been the site of Elijah's most polluting factory in Malaysia. The world's media would be there, along with environmental leaders, corporate executives, and even a few former board members who had once opposed Elijah's transformation. As they approached the main research building, they could see people gathering, camera crews setting up. Dr. Patel spotted them and waved, looking proud in his formal attire, a rare sight for the scientist who usually preferred field clothes. "Hard to believe how far we've come," Elijah murmured. It truly was remarkable. What had started as one reforestation project in Costa Rica had grown into a global network of research centers, each focused on solving environmental challenges specific to their regions. The Montgomery Trust had expanded, joined by other wealthy individuals inspired by Elijah's example. More surprisingly, Montgomery Innovations, the company Elijah had walked away from, had recently approached them about a partnership. Under new leadership, the corporation was finally recognizing that sustainable practices weren't just ethical, but profitable in the long run. "Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery," called a friendly voice. It was Thomas, Lena's former data analyst, who now directed the Institute's technology division. "Everyone's ready whenever you are." Elijah still looked slightly dazed whenever someone called Lena by his last name. Their wedding 2 years ago had been simple, just a small ceremony on the beach near their first reforestation site, attended by the people who had become their family. As they walked toward the podium, Lena felt Elijah hesitate. She looked up at him questioningly. "I was just thinking about that bet we made," he said softly. "How angry you were with me at that charity gala. How certain I was that I knew everything." Lena smiled. "You were pretty insufferable. And yet here we are." His eyes held a depth of emotion that still took a breath away. "I thought I had everything back then. I had nothing." Behind them, a small child's voice called out, "Mama, Papa." They turned to see Maya, their 3-year-old daughter, running toward them from where Riley had been watching her. With her curly hair bouncing and arms outstretched, she was the perfect blend of her parents, Elijah's eyes, Lena's smile, and a determination entirely her own. Elijah scooped her up, his face lighting with joy. "There's my girl. Are you ready to see Papa give his boring speech?" Mia nodded solemnly. "Not boring. Trees." Lena laughed. "She knows what matters." Looking at her family, at the thriving forest around them, at the people gathered to celebrate a vision becoming reality, Lena felt a completeness she'd never imagined possible. The angry environmentalist and the cold billionaire who could have predicted their journey? As they walked together toward the podium, Elijah whispered, "Best bet I ever lost." Lena smiled up at him. "I think we both won." With their daughter between them, they stepped onto the stage to share their story. Not just of environmental restoration, but of personal transformation. Of how one person's passion had awakened another's purpose. Of how love and conviction could create a legacy more meaningful than money ever could. And as Elijah began to speak, his voice strong and clear in the morning air, Lena watched the faces in the crowd, scientists, workers, journalists, executives, all listening to a man who had once valued only profit now speak about protection, preservation, and possibility. The world was listening, things were changing. And it had all begun with a challenge at a charity gala, a bet between unlikely opponents who became the most likely of partners.